Welcome to this special episode of the 3CL Foundation podcast, produced in the run-up to Young People's Summit, a gathering that amplifies youth perspectives on digital culture, education and democracy. I'm Nina Shangelia, and today I'm joined by Mr. Bertrand Borg, journalist at the Times of Malta, and a long-term observer of how technology, social media and public policy intersect in Europe. Together, we'll explore how young people navigate the digital world, from misinformation and mental health to the promise of AI and media literacy. Our goal is to understand how Europe's next generation can reclaim agency online, shaping technology rather than being shaped by it. Mr. Borg, thank you so much for joining. I know how busy you are, and I'm going to move on to my first question. From your reporting in Times of Malta and across Europe, how would you describe the current digital experience of young people?
Hi, Dina. In Malta, young people tend to primarily experience the internet through social media apps, and not all social media apps, primarily through Instagram and TikTok. And there's an anecdote I often recount, which I think says a lot. Every year I speak to third-year university students to give them an idea of what journalism is like, and so on and so forth. And every year I ask them to tell me where they get their news from. And I've seen this pattern. I think I've been doing this for 5, 6, 7 years, something like this. Every year, fewer and fewer news platforms are actually mentioned. And last year, for the first time ever, not a single one of these students in class actually went to a news site to get their news. They all said they got their news from social media. And I think that's reflective of the broader young public in Malta.
Absolutely. I think that's that's one of the current trends, that majority of young people get their news from social media, which is why it's so questionable, because we are not sure whether they are getting balanced feeds, whether they are checking their sources. And I think we've seen results of this in many countries across Europe. And social media has played a hugely important role in pre-election periods as well, because young people only see one side of the story. They watch reels, which is sometimes out of context, or it's aimed at concrete political messaging, and they make decision based on that one side of the story, which is highly dangerous. And in light of this, do you see sort of disinformation risks with the high usage of social media, and also with the increasing usage of Gen AI? Do you witness, sort of as a journalist, do you see disinformation risks on daily basis?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's worth saying this is not just a risk for young people, right? It's a risk for people of all ages, um, young, but also especially the old, or the 60 plus, let's say, the people who are not digital natives, who maybe missed kind of the internet boom, who struggle to get used to technology. We've run a series of articles over the past month or two about people being conned into romance scams and other sorts of things online, which most young people who are digital natives will laugh at, because they say, "Oh, this is obviously fake." It's the prime minister trying to sell you cryptocurrency or whatever. They laugh at that stuff because they're used. They're used to navigating the internet, so they're that savvy when it comes to that perspective. But as you say, there's a lack of media literacy concerning all stretches of population, including young people, which I think is a huge missed opportunity, given that the internet's not a new thing now. It's 25 years old, so we're well into the second or third generation of students learning online. So you'd expect education policymakers to have caught up to this and become savvy to this, because the people making education policy today grew up partially online, so they know what's out there, and where the risks lie. Now, I mean, that's not to say that media, there was, before the internet, everyone was media literate, or had a level an adequate level of media literacy. It's just that the proliferation of information online, and as you said, you hinted at the way in which algorithms can kind of steer people towards one side of a story or one perspective to a story, um, amplifies those risks and makes it much less likely for people to get a broad spectrum of views on any given issue.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as a journalist, because I've actually attended a journalist conference in Perugia last year, and there was one of the panels where I attended. There was a talk of how much journalists rely on AI these days, and whether sort of traditional news outlets like Times of Malta, for example, whether they had any tools in order to guide their journalists and their staff through AI policy. I realize that this is a new, still pretty much new. So I'm not saying that all newsrooms have it, but more or less it's in the process of implementation.
Yes.
So what's
We
your view on that?
Yeah, we have internal we have an AI policy which for journalists, and we have got which are essentially guidelines on how to use AI. Um, they're they're not overly complicated, but and they can kind of be summarized um, by saying journalists are not allowed to generate content writing using AI or photos or images or so on and so forth. Um, and any though they're encouraged to use AI for their work if they find it helpful. However, anything that involves AI must needs to be a human in the loop. So, it needs to be the content, the input and the output needs to be human generated. And we've created kind of custom GPTs which can help um, the journalists identify flaws in their articles, for instance, right? Or brainstorm ideas for follow-up questions or interview questions for subjects. I think generative AI is already kind of helpful in that respect, in terms of brainstorming, in terms of kind of thinking outside the usual confines of where your mind goes. Um, but you see the risk of hallucination. I mean, you can see it everywhere. One thing about Gen AI, because you mentioned Gen AI and young people, one thing I notice is that um, young people are increasingly using LLMs as a search tool, and that, I mean, it's still in its initial phase, but I imagine that will have a huge impact on publishers, especially publishers which rely on Google search traffic as that increases. And while Google is not, let's say, the most generous um, company with publishers in terms of its compensation to publishers, LLMs are even less generous because they literally just scrape our sites even without permission, even when they're instructed not to. So I think that's going to be a big challenge. Of course, big players like, I mean, if you're the Financial Times or the New York Times, you can sign a multi-million deal with OpenAI to provide their content, to provide content to them. That's fine. Or if you're New York Times, you can sue OpenAI. But for smaller publishers like the Times of Malta, that's not really an option. And when you see tools like Sora 2, for instance, making it so easy to rip off copyrighted, trademarked characters, for instance. If OpenAI doesn't care about annoying Disney, then I don't think there's much hope for them respecting the wishes of small publishers like Times of Malta.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings me to my next question, actually, that how do you resist the competition that you're facing? I mean, I'm talking sort of commercially and financially. How do this, what would be the advice for survival for small news outlets, especially when we see that, um, you know, uh, what sells these days? It's whatever goes viral and whatever's sort of one-sided and whatever has sensational news titles. So for news outlets who are traditional, who fact check, who have good reputation, it's really hard to compete with those pieces that go viral all of a sudden. And then we live in this filter bubble where after 24 hours, we actually can't keep a track of what was right and what was wrong, what was fake or what was real. Like, it's all surreal. And one of the methods of Russian propaganda is to spread many different versions of disinformation. So in actual fact, you don't know the truth. So when it comes to legitimate news outlets like Times of Malta competing sort of in square brackets with those illegitimate sources that go viral online really quickly, where does your position lie in this sense? Like, do you have to compromise and make your titles a bit more sensationalist? And also, you touched upon monetization and you mentioned Google, but when it comes to platforms, do you feel that, the platform should have different approach when it comes to sharing legitimate news online, and should outlets like Times of Malta be compensated?
So, for the first part of your question, we combat misinformation. So we are the only news outlet in Malta to run a form of fact checking service, in collaboration with
Medmo
Mediterranean.
network,
Yes,
yeah,
exactly, with the Medmo
Medmo.
network. That's right. And that's proven popular. We encourage readers to submit their request for fact checks. So if there's a statement or something, or is a post or something that they've seen and they're not sure about, there's a Google form in which they can fill in and ask us to fact check it. And a lot of our fact checks are kind of reader generated. So that's one way in which we try to combat this misinformation. There is always the inclination to drive towards clickbait, sensationalist headlines, and there's a lot of research which shows how outrage fuels engagement. And I think ultimately our role in society we need to be clear about our mission statement. And we have become even clearer about our mission statement in the past year. We were the first Maltese outlet to introduce a, a paywall strategy, essentially. So we ask regular readers are asked to contribute, to subscribe, to continue reading our content. And that kind of shift in monetization strategy also comes with a shift in the way in which we think about the content we provide our readers. Ultimately, I think in the long run, people want information that's relevant to them, which is novel, which gives them insight into their communities or into their lives, into their interests, and which is relevant to them. And I think we need to play to our strengths, and our strengths are the people who write our content, who go out there and speak to people every day, who have their contacts, who are working to find that relevant information. We need to play to those strengths. I think if we're going to try and play if we try to compete on the content generation front, it's a losing battle, because there's no way in which we can compete in terms of content generation with the kind of content farms that are sprouting out every day. So I don't think we should go down that route. You also had a second part to your question, which I'm sorry I can't recall it right now.
Yes, it was about how much do you see the platforms should carry responsibility to legitimate news online outlets, where
Ah,
that for monetization purposes, because different countries have different policies on this. Like Australia has different policy, for example. But when it comes to
yes.
Europe, how much do you think the platforms are giving back to society and giving back to legitimate news outlets like yourself?
Well, I mean, LLMs like ChatGPT would be useless without their inputs. They would be absolutely useless. So I don't know what the model looks like in terms of the nitty-gritty, but I know for a fact that there needs to be some sort of revenue share, not just with news outlets, when they take their content, but with artists and creatives and researchers and all the content which is fed into an LLM. Um, it can we cannot live in a world in which we expect the free press to be free, right? Journalism costs money, and we have a newsroom here. We have journalists, photographers, video editors, sub editors. These people, it takes time and effort and knowledge and skill and money to create, to verify and publish the information, which is then fed into, before it was search engines, now it's increasingly LLMs, which then provide information to people. So I think there needs to be some sort of model which acknowledges that I don't know what it looks like. I don't have the answer. If I did, I'd be in a higher paying job somewhere else. But it seems clear to me that the current system is broken.
Absolutely, and thanks for your honesty. I think it's important to keep the conversation going when it comes to sort of responsibility and platform liability that these platforms are carrying. On the one hand, they very easily violate our human rights, starting from right to privacy, to right to compensation, intellectual property, etc. But on the other hand, when it comes to legal responsibility, there is not much holding them accountable. I mean, there is Europe-wide AI Act, which is an initiative to sort of tame the big platforms. But again, is this enough? Because once genie's out of bottle, legal framework is finding it really hard to keep up with technological changes, because tech changes are developing at the speed of light and legal framework is, behind. So it's important to keep conversation going. And that's why Young People's Summit is important. This is one of the areas that we're going to touch upon in order to view sort of traditional journalism as opposed to new journalism, online journalism, digital journalism, street journalism. We need to view it in different lens. And with regards to digital citizenship, I would like to ask a question. Your question as a social media user, which I'm sure you use, and also as a journalist. Sort of, if you post something on your social media, do you often find that it's ultimately associated with your news outlet, or do you still try to distinguish and make a difference whether the meaning is ascribed to your news outlet or whether it's your personal view? And have you had sort of complication or overlap in this sense, and do you see this as a problem when it comes to online journalism?
So I am a minimal. I am present on practically all social media platforms, but I post next to nothing on them. In large part because of this issue. So we have. I'm one of the editors at Times of Malta. We have some editors who are more active than I am, um, and have more active profiles on social media. And I do not. I made a decision years ago, to basically not post on social media, because I do not want any mixed messages going out. People will automatically associate what I write with Times of Malta, irrespective of whether I say it's in my personal capacity or not, and they rightly so, right? Because my perspectives shape the news in which we carry, and the way in which we deliver the news. So I did not want to send out any mixed messages, because if I and one of the other editors disagree on something, and I'm saying this is red and the other says it's blue, or whatever, I don't want any of those mixed messages to go out. That said, I think the increasing trend is for people all over the world, not just in Malta, people to trust individuals more than platforms or networks or media organizations. And people tend to latch on and follow individual voices more than official ones, right? And we see this. We have a couple of journalists who have um, pretty large social media followings, and although they themselves have dialed back their personal posts as well, out of similar concerns, not because we give them any instructions to do so. The output on Times of Malta is very clearly branded with their image and their name and their everything, right? It is their program. and that resonates with people. And I think that we're seeing an increasing shift in that direction. Overseas, you see it with Substack and Patreon and kind of individual journalists branching out and having these huge followings. In Malta, the reality of the economies of scale mean that's, it hasn't really happened, but you still see an increasing shift towards trust in the individual rather than the network.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair assessment because individual voices do go far along. But then again, we are at the risk of anyone being a journalist, anyone who has big following, and anyone spreading any message they want without much accountability. So that's the risk that I think one carries in this world. And with that in mind, as we are preparing for Young People Summit, where we hope to see you in person, I would like to ask, what advice would you give, because it will mainly be attended by young people, for people who are choosing their careers or thinking of going into different careers, and looking at journalism. I'm actually a lawyer by background, but sort of one of the choices that I was considering back when I was making my decision was journalism, but then in the end I went with law. But for people who are at the crossroads, what would you advise in this century, in this sort of digital era? What should they pay attention to when choosing this profession, and what should they expect?
If you're thinking of being a journalist, or you think you might want to be a journalist, I would encourage you to very actively seek out perspectives different to the one you hold on any given issue. So if you're reading about something, the news topic of the week or whatever it is, make an effort, a conscious effort, to find different perspectives on that topic. It will help you understand more about the people you might be writing for one day. It'll help you understand where your eventual critics are coming from, and it will also help you understand that there's very often many sides to a story, or many perspectives on a story. And that doesn't mean that truth is subjective. Facts are facts, right? But even in issues where the facts are very clear, it's important to understand where the other side is coming from, or how the other side is interpreting those facts, because otherwise we're just preaching to the choir.
Yeah, I think that's probably a very, very practical and sort of realistic advice that people can take on board. Mr. Borg, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And I'm sure our audience will find this podcast very interesting, especially for people who are already working in journalism or studying journalism or thinking about tech career change, etc. So thank you so much and good luck with everything.
Thank you, Lina. My pleasure.